And I wanted to thank you all for coming out today, and I will not be here too long, right? I want to give you a context for why I wrote this, hopefully convince you to read it. So I'll read as little of this as possible, because we all know academic books are really exciting, right? And really address what I think is a future direction that we need to be talking about, but all too often we speak too little about, which is the context of the suburbs, right? So when I started out working on this book in 2006, one of the first things people asked was, oh, you study education? And I said, yeah, I study education, and I study black education and the experiences of students of color. And they're like, where? You know, is it New York? Is it Chicago? Is it Detroit? Is it LA? And I was like, it's in the suburbs. And they were like, say what? Right? It's almost like there is a neat and discrete disconnect from the idea of people of color and suburban spaces. And when I started to think about education and think about all the great writing we have from a variety of folks, I realized that the experiences of families of color, of low-income families in the suburbs was largely absent from the conversation that we've had. We know that suburbanization has been happening in this country for over 30 years for people of color, over 30 years for low-income folks, but when we look at what's been written about it, there's a very small amount. And I think testimony to that is moments that, like we recently experienced in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, if I asked you a month and a half ago where Ferguson was, how many of y'all would know? In fact, if you told me to find it on a map, I'd have been like, well, let me Google it, right? And even when folks heard Ferguson, they were like, oh, it's St. Louis. And in fact, it's a suburb of St. Louis, right? Ferguson is the type of community that has transitioned for decades without people noticing. It's a community that historically has been predominantly white and has moved to majority black. It's actually a community that has a mixture of white and black, but when we look at the public schools that are there, they're overwhelmingly black. When we look at the school leadership, it's overwhelmingly white. When we look at the school board, it's all white. When we look at the city council and the mayor, it's also disturbingly not reflective of the population. And for me, talking about the suburbs means to have conversations about race and class at the same time. It's not either or, it's and both. And so when I set out to do this book, I said, well, I want to talk about something different. I want to go into the suburban context and in part, speak a little bit back to my own story. I was not raised in the midst of poverty. As I said, I wasn't jumping over crack vials, as Bill O'Reilly would like you to believe, right? I came of age in a neighborhood that was staunchly working class. Right? So there were folks who had jobs, there were folks who didn't have jobs. I grew up on the same street that my father grew up on, and this was not necessarily the oasis that many people had imagined. Right? It was a place where we would deal with issues of addiction, where we would deal with a community celebrating someone returning from incarceration, but also celebrate people going off to college. Right? It was that type of mix that I felt was missing from our discussion of the experiences of particularly African American communities. So it's with this, I hope to help us begin the conversation about where we are. Because when we look at recent demographics, we know that over 50% of black families in urban areas, their children are raised in the suburbs, right? So if you have more than half of the folks in urban areas and their children being raised in suburbs and we're not talking about it, we're missing a really wide portion of our community. And not only that, I didn't want to simply look at the experiences of black families, but look at the relationships that existed across race and across class. Because I think it's an absolutely incomplete portrait to simply talk about the lives and experiences of African Americans without also talking about white Americans and the ways in which competition over resources, the ways in which collaboration occurs, and how that creates a complex fabric. Right? And that's really what has been missing for so long in our discourse. So when I set out in Rolling Acres to do my study, I was really excited, and I went through all the rigmarole of IRB, and I went through mailing out letters to homes, and I asked people to talk to me, and like a good researcher, I soon realized nobody reads the mail, right? And I remember identifying a family that I wanted to speak to, and I finally got a chance to speak to her, and I call her Miss Tolles, and I want to tell you a little bit about my experience when I first went to her home. I pulled up to the small blue ranch-style house nestled at the back of a crowded cul-de-sac and exited my Honda Civic. As I walked to the door, I surveyed the neighborhood and saw houses huddled around the oil-stained street. The home sat there, small lawns that were maintained yet not manicured. The street sat quiet, and with a few cars lining it and a basketball hoop in the cul-de-sac. I rang the doorbell and I was greeted by Mrs. Tolles, a jolly yet respect-inducing lawyer and the mother of Jeffrey, a fourth grader at River Elementary. She walked me into her home and introduced me to her house guest. Her house guest was another African-American woman in her late 40s. She sparked the conversation. "This is LaRue. He's here to talk to me about Jeffrey." Her guest sat down, watched patiently, and then Ms. Tolles turned and said, "He's going to solve the achievement gap." Right. Much like you, her house guest erupted into laughter, right? In which I uncomfortably and nervously joined in, and I assured her, "I'm not here to solve the achievement gap," right? But it reminded me for so often and for so long, people have thought that we'll find the solution in research, right? In part, research illuminates some of what's occurring, but it's never the full solution. It's about understanding the process, but we need to move towards the policies. So as I started to look at themes of what was occurring, one of the things that I thought was absolutely missing from our conversation is what some sociologists have called opportunity hoarding, which means when you go to places that are suburban, when you go to places that have ample resources, you often find a competition for those resources. So even if there is more than enough academic material to go around, if there are more than enough advanced placement programs, families organize and work to limit the access of other families. And in my book, one of the things I talk about is not simply looking at the question of Black deficit. A large amount of research starts with Black children are behind, and we know they're behind because they come from families who are low income, who haven't been in these spaces. And I said, well, we need to reorient that question, right? What does it mean to have families that are competing for resources and families that are locked away from opportunity? Get back to some of the relationships that undergird society instead of assuming in one set or one group that there is something unequal, right, or unclear about them. I also wanted to get a sense and speak directly to what some people call the new racism. The election of Barack Obama was magical, right? Some people waited for that moment, and when I started to interview children before and after the election of Barack Obama, I met a number of parents, mainly white parents, who were excited about the prospect of Obama's election. And when I started to talk to them about race, they emphasized wanting to be in Rolling Acres as a suburb because it was so diverse, right? One parent said, when I look at my child's class picture, it looks like a session at the UN, right? The reality was there were probably in that entire class picture, there were probably about 8 kids of color of 30, right? But for someone who was raised in a segregated community, that looks like substantial progress. And so I wanted to interrogate what were the attitudes around race, what were the beliefs, and what were the ways in which adults responded to the racial realities that young people faced. And I want to read to you a longer excerpt from the book, from a chapter I call "A Few Bad Apples Are Racist." On a warm May afternoon, Summer and Monique sat in the classroom at Cherry Elementary after the other students had filed out for lunch and recess. This was not an odd occurrence, since students often had additional work, asked to stay in, or wanted to have one-on-one conversation with the teacher, Miss Jackson. Today, however, Summer and Monique sat sullenly as they awaited a reprimand from their teacher. Don't worry about that. Has an OtterBox. Normally chatty, today Summer and Monique sat in silence. They were the only 2 African-American girls in Miss Jackson's classroom, and they tended to spend great amounts of time together inside and outside of the school. As I prepared to go outside to observe research, I watched Jamila, a petite biracial, black and white girl from the neighboring 4th grade classroom, slip into the room. She sat down with a look of disgust on her face. As she took her seat, Miss Jackson began to speak in an even yet demanding tone. Earlier in the day, Summer, Jamila, and Monique had been involved in an incident during which they had called another student white trash. Miss Jackson, an African-American woman, asked all the girls to imagine, what would I do if someone called me a name similar to that? She then said to the girls, what I want you to do is write about how racism is connected to the name that you called that young lady. The 3 girls sat at their desks poised to write, but none began moving their pen. As they sat, Miss Jackson busied herself tidying up the room, and then she continued, you know, when I was little, I was the first black family in town, and they tried to keep us up. The kids did name calling too. You can be racist. When you call them white trash, it opens up the playing field. The girls sat with their pens resting on papers, positioned to write, but their hands still did not move. With their blank faces, they looked like sailors on deck waiting for the storm to blow over their weather-battered ship. Then one of the girls broke the silence. Jamila retorted, "They can call me names because I know I'm not." Miss Jackson stopped mid-pace, spun around and said, "But your parents didn't raise you to have a trashy mouth." Pleased with having gotten a rise out of Miss Jackson, Jamila's mouth crocked into a smirk, and she began giggling. Miss Jackson, likely realizing her monologue had not moved Jamila or the other girls, decided to shift her approach. Think about the little girl. If she goes home and tells her parents, they'll be mad and at your doorstep later. Jamila quickly spurted out, "But she started it." Miss Jackson barked back, "Doesn't matter who started it." As Monique and Summer sat silently watching Miss Jackson and Jamila joust, Miss Jackson realized that she was losing the battle with a 10-year-old on racial ethics. "Why it's bad to call people's names. Write that title down," Miss Jackson commanded. And as the girls wrote the title, Miss Jackson walked over to her desk to retrieve some papers. When she returned to the girls, who were now begrudgingly writing, she stopped to Monique's desk, looked at the paper, and said, "That's a good start." One of the things I talk about in the chapter is that in this racial moment, there's a huge emphasis on the notion of equality. That if name calling on a playground between black students and white students occurs, that we've reached a level racial playing ground. When I looked at the experiences of teachers and how they treated children, they often did not pay attention to the differences in power and the differences in history. Instead, race was something that was only thought about as momentarily relevant. When I asked teachers about their classroom, they said, "I believe in diversity, I believe in equality." And I said, "Well, are there ever any racial tensions?" They say, "Only sometimes when there are a couple bad apples." But when I started to interview families, I found that race was a central chord running throughout. Yes, there may be incidents of name calling, but there were far greater incidents in which the systematic nature of everyday sorted children. In one of the classrooms that I observed, 50% of the black students by 4th grade had IEPs. They were marked as in need of special education. I said, well, either there's something in the water in the black side of town, or there's a process of sorting that many of these schools have not dealt with. And so what the book really does is try to go into the day-to-day experiences of families to try to see how they've lived race, what has been overlooked about it, and what can be done. My goal with this is to really challenge some of the current narrative we have around education, which assumes, one, everything is about class. It's really about poor kids and not poor kids. In the schools that I observed, there were low-income kids, there were middle-class kids, there were affluent kids, and still, if you were a member of the black racial group across class, you caught hell, right? The other set of logic or argument is that race is the only thing that matters. And I realized that for those middle-class black families that had moved to the suburb by choice, their movement there did not absolve them of the responsibility of stewarding their children carefully. So I talk about the hypervigilance that is necessary to raise black children and healthy black children in suburban spaces. Ultimately, what I hope is that this book will open up a dialogue about what schools can do. I've begun to do some work with local suburban districts, as well as some districts that are more distal, to talk about what is happening in your school. Because suburban schools for a long time have been assumed to be well-functioning, have been assumed to be desirable. But ultimately, when we look at the experiences of children coming from ethnic minority backgrounds and economic backgrounds, their experiences remain separate and unequal.